Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something truly fascinating. It's what happens when human ingenuity smacks right into an environmental brick wall. We're talking about survival architecture, specifically how ninth century Scandinavian settlers who were used to building these, grand longhouses out of a ton of timber, suddenly found themselves in the North Atlantic, a place where large trees, well, they just didn't exist. And that created this immediate existential crisis.
It's a remarkable pivot, and our sources document it really clearly. So for this deep dive, we're going to explore that transition, moving away from the timber structures that define their whole society to eating the turf bay, the turf building. Our mission is to really unpack the engineering behind it, the material science, and how it was so crucial for surviving those long, brutal Arctic winters.
And this wasn't just a tough adjustment. This was a full-on environmental reckoning. They get to places like Iceland and Greenland expecting forests. And instead they find, reich, grass, and scrub brush. You have almost no large trees. And you compound that with these severe winters and just constant bone-chilling winds. A traditional wooden building, it just wouldn't stand a chance.
Not at all. Their original blueprint was fatally flawed the second they stepped off the longship. So the crisis forced a choice: either abandon the settlement or invent something totally new with only what the land gave you.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the lack of wood, which was the anchor of their whole building method, it forced an immediate question. If timber's out, what's the new anchor?
That material constraint was the absolute starting point. The Viking longhouse needed massive wooden frames, plank siding, things that demand large, straight trees. The North Atlantic islands offered, well, none of that. The few native trees were small birch or willow, totally useless for load-bearing structures.
Which pushed them right to turf, peat, and earth. I mean, those materials were everywhere. They were abundant and surprisingly robust. But they didn't completely give up on wood, did they?
No, not entirely. They used every single piece of driftwood that washed ashore. The sources make it clear that collecting driftwood was seen as incredibly valuable. It was almost like mining. And that driftwood became the essential framing, the internal supports.
But the real genius was in how they used the earth itself. They weren't just digging up loose soil.
No, that's a key point. They were meticulously cutting out these thick, heavy blocks of turf. They're sometimes called stranker or naus. And the crucial part is the dense root system inside that block. When you stack them, the roots act like a natural reinforcement. It's like organic rebar that binds the wall together.
So they were cutting bricks, not shaping beams. Walk us through that building process, because it sounds like immense labor.
It was pure muscle and repetition. They'd clear a foundation, sometimes digging down a little bit to stabilize the structure, and then they would just stack these turf blocks, layer by layer, in an alternating pattern, a bit like laying bricks today, to maximize the stability.
And the most stunning detail to me, the thing that just screams necessity, is the wall thickness.
Exactly. To get the insulation and stability they needed against that relentless wind, these walls were huge. We're talking turf walls between 1.5 and 2 meters thick.
That's 5 to 6.5 feet?
Yes, 5 to 6 feet of densely packed earth and roots. That's your primary thermal barrier. It's just a radical shift in engineering.
And they didn't stop there. They'd often dig the foundation down a bit so the house was partially embedded in the ground. That helps with the wind, of course, but it's also about leveraging the earth's temperature. And the roof, that was also made of turf, right? Laid over that precious driftwood frame.
Right. It created this single, monolithic, organic structure. The effort was Herculean, for sure, but the payoff was immediate. It was measurable and, survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's focus on those 2-meter thin walls and how they basically created a form of passive thermal engineering.
Right. This is the physics of survival. The torque bay was so effective because it tackled heat loss in a few different ways. We need to think about density, thermal mass, and air movement.
Okay, so when we think insulation today, we think of fiberglass or foam, things that trap air. Turf doesn't really do that in the same way. So why did it work so much better than wood?
It comes down to thermal mass, and that's a key engineering concept they mastered, probably through intuition. Think of that 2-meter wall as a giant thermal battery.
A thermal battery, okay.
Wood has low thermal mass. It heats up fast, but it also cools down fast. Turf and earth have incredibly high thermal mass, so that means the wall absorbs heat very slowly, and more importantly, it releases that heat slowly. It creates something engineers call thermal lag.
So what does that mean for the people inside the house on a cold night?
It means if the temperature plummets outside, that cold takes days, maybe even weeks, to actually migrate through 6 feet of compressed earth. It prevents that rapid temperature drop inside that would have, frozen the inhabitants.
That's an incredible survival advantage. And on top of that, you have the ultimate windbreak.
Precisely. Those North Atlantic winds will just strip heat from a normal building, but the sheer mass of the turf wall meant the wind just couldn't penetrate the structure. It minimized air exchange and kept all that precious internal heat right where it needed to be.
Okay, but if they dug the house partially into the ground, what about dampness? Spring thaws. It sounds like a recipe for mildew and misery.
That's a great question. And yes, dampness was a constant struggle. That's why drainage around the house was critical. And inside, they'd usually have wooden plank flooring raised just a bit above the earth. But the thermal benefits, they just outweighed the dampness problem. By embedding the house, they were using the geothermal stability of the land itself. The ground maintains a pretty constant temperature year-round.
And then you have the roof.
The turf roof was just ingenious. In the winter, snow piles up on it.
Which is an amazing insulator.
A superb zero-cost insulator. Snow is mostly trapped air, so it acts like this perfect thermal blanket on top of the house. You end up with a complete thermal envelope built entirely from the land itself.
So let's talk about the warmth inside. The sources mention a small central hearth for cooking and heat, but a huge part of the equation was just people.
Absolutely. Human bodies give off a steady amount of heat, so you gather a dozen or more family members into one main, well-insulated room, the scully, and their collective body heat becomes a major contributor to the temperature.
And the animals, too. They were often part of the same complex.
Right, they developed these layouts where the living quarters were attached to byres for the livestock. The body heat from cows and sheep in an adjacent structure would passively warm the main house right through the shared walls. It's an integrated, closed-loop system for warmth.
It sounds incredibly function, but maybe a little oppressive. What did the sources say about, the air quality, the smell of damp earth and smoke?
Oh, it was definitely dark. Light came from a small smoke vent in the roof and the glow of the hearth, and the smell was unavoidable, a mix of smoke, damp earth, animals, and the people themselves. But comfort and aesthetics, they weren't the priority.
Heat retention was everything.
Exactly. The entire indoor life cooking, weaving, storytelling, it all happened in this space designed to conserve every single calorie of warmth.
It's fascinating, and that leads directly into the social aspect, which is surprisingly egalitarian.
It really is. In mainland Scandinavia, your longhouse was a status symbol. Bigger hall, richer chief.
But here, the climate leveled the playing field. Everyone needed a 2-meter-thick turf wall.
Precisely. The sources confirm that basic design was mandatory for survival, rich or poor. You couldn't build a big, showy timber hall because the wood wasn't there, and even if it was, a thin-walled building meant a frozen death. The turf house became universal.
But I'm sure chieftains still found ways to show off their status, right? Hierarchy couldn't have just vanished.
That's a sharp observation. It didn't vanish, it just moved indoors. While the outside structure was the same for everyone, the wealthy would use imported timber for, say, internal paneling or carved details. Status was visible in the furnishings, in imported metals and jewelry, and maybe in the size of the internal layout, bigger hearths, but not in the exterior walls.
So the architecture was a great leveler, but the interior design upheld the status quo. Now, what about maintenance? This wasn't a set it and forget it kind of building.
Not at all. Turf is organic. It decomposes, it compresses, it shifts. The materials that kept them alive also demanded constant work. These were living structures. After a hard winter, the roof would need new blocks of turf. The walls might slump and need shoring up.
So a big part of their year wasn't just farming, but actively managing their own homes. It wasn't spring hoeing, it was structural renovation.
It really was. Living in a torf bay was an ongoing relationship with the land. It's a huge contrast with the permanence of stone or large timber structures back in Norway.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the turf house isn't some singular, unique invention, is it?
Far from it. This kind of adaptation using earth and sod, building thick, low-profile structures, it's a common strategy you find among many northern peoples, from the sod houses on the American plains to indigenous Arctic dwellings. It points to a universal principle. When you're facing a treeless, windy, cold environment, the answer is always to use the earth's insulating properties.
And that ancient ingenuity hasn't been lost. In fact, it's making a huge comeback today.
Yes. The principles the Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago are at the core of modern sustainable design. We're seeing a revival of building with passive heating, with super thick walls with natural earth materials. Think about earth ships, which use packed earth in tire walls for thermal mass. or architects specifying living roofs with sod for insulation.
They were doing zero-energy building out of sheer necessity, long before we even had a term for it.
Exactly. They understood that the most efficient heating system is the structure itself.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. The takeaway here is incredibly clear. The Torf Bay is this powerful symbol of human ingenuity. It's the ultimate example of overcoming extreme conditions not with complex tech, but by deeply understanding the simplest materials available, the Earth itself.
Yeah, the Viking settlers were forced into this, but in doing so, they created something profoundly effective and perfectly suited to its environment. They were engineering survival systems right into the landscape.
So what does this all mean? It means that innovation so often comes from extreme limitation. When their old resources were gone, they had to see the land not as an obstacle, but as their primary resource.
It definitely makes you question our modern reliance on high-tech solutions.
Exactly. We've spent a century designing these energy-hungry homes that need constant mechanical help furnaces, air conditioning to be livable. But when you look at the Viking turf house, a structure with 6-foot thick walls and a snow-covered roof that achieved climate stability with zero external energy, it really makes you ask, how far have we strayed from that? Or maybe, how much are we finally returning to those ancient principles of thick, natural insulation in our own energy crisis? That's something to mull over.